Think forward. Think Research Channel.
The opinions expressed in the following program are strictly those of the speaker. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation.
From the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. This is Frontier, discussions of today's most exciting research subjects by distinguished scientists and engineers working at the frontiers of knowledge.
It is a pleasure to be here at the NSF today, and thank you for the very kind introduction. I am a friend of the NSF, and I have been since the old days when you used to provide some research money to me at Stanford. A belated thank you after 35 years.
We accept.
But I think it's an extremely interesting time to have a discussion of this sort, because we're in the middle of two interesting phenomena in the United States. One is a presidential campaign, and the second is a slowdown in our economy, or somewhat people talking about recession, although I don't think we're quite in an official recession yet. But the issue of competitiveness and the impact of science and technology and what that has on the future of the U.S., as most of you noticed, has not been a lively part of the presidential debate. In fact, it hasn't been part of the debate here in Washington, D.C., although everyone acknowledged the need to be competitive, and the president put it in his State of the Union message a couple years ago. The Democratic leadership picked it up in the House as their competitive initiative, and we had a great authorization to increase the basic research budget for the federal government, including NSF, and also to do some good work in the area of math and science and education, especially K through 12 education in the United States. Unfortunately, in the appropriations process and the final budget at the end of the year, I guess maybe to the surprise of some, all of that fell out. And the basis for my discussion today is going to be, when will these people wake up, and when will the United States decide that it has to compete for a living? And I'm of the opinion that we haven't decided to compete as a country yet. We're very willing to try to take ourselves back a decade or two to the good old days, and why can't we just be fat, dumb, and happy like we were in the 90s when our economy was soaring and average salaries were going up, etc. Instead of having the discussion of what to do about math and science and innovation in the U.S., if you've listened to the presidential candidates, you've heard on the one side Senator McCain say, "I don't know anything about the economy, therefore don't ask me." And on the other side, it's how fast can we get back to the 90s and when the times were good under the Clinton administration. At least that's Senator Clinton's position. And Senator Obama is saying, "Trust me, things will get better." I've been in business long enough not to trust anybody, and I'd like to see some concrete suggestions. But we'll talk a little bit about some trends, and the trends are exactly shown in that video. And if you study economics at all, and if you look at the business world, you have to recognize that in the last 10 or 15 years, dramatic things have happened in the world. And the dramatic things, the end of the Cold War, the fact that India decided to forego its isolationist tendencies and nationalistic tendencies and open up to the world. The fact that China decided to open up in the world. If you take the Chinese population, the Indian population, the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, some of the Middle East, which is opened up, you get about 3 million people, give or take, a few hundred million. 3 billion people is half of the world's population. My contention is there's only once in the history of mankind that half of the world overnight decides that it's going to join a new economic system, that is the world's free economic system. That only happens once in the history of mankind. And when it does happen, there's likely to be lots of change that takes place. And when change takes place, there's likely to be lots of winners and losers. And what we're facing now is that change that's ongoing, and the fact that people are adjusting their national strategies to the future. And I would think that the United States would take time out to reflect on what's going on and to say, we probably need to do something differently going forward. And if you talk to government leaders around the world and you talk to any knowledgeable academics or scientists, they always kind of say the same thing exactly. They say, okay, if you want to compete in today's world where technology has made it a flat world in Tom Friedman's terminology, or if you read Clyde Prestowitz's book, 3 Billion New Capitalists, it's a very flat world and lots of people in it. The only way you compete going forward is with very simple fundamentals. You need smart people. By the way, I'm assuming here that you want to maintain a high standard of living. You need smart people, you need smart ideas, and then you need an environment to get smart people together with smart ideas to do something. Translated, that means you need a good educational process. You need investment in research and development, basic R&D, which is really the seed corn of the future. And then you need to have government policies which promote the investment in innovation, promote smart people getting together with smart ideas and doing things. And the environment, very simply, is things like the rule of law, tax policy, how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to get your money out, the normal capitalist type of things, sort of things that CEOs of companies are interested in every day when they make investments going forward. So it really boils down to education, investment in R&D, and the right environment for investment in innovation. Those are the basic requirements. And what I'd like to do is I'll come back to those three things in a few moments. But what I need to talk a little bit about semiconductors, because Intel makes semiconductors, and you'd be disappointed if I didn't come to the National Science Foundation and talk about technology. So I want to talk a little bit about technology, then we'll come back to this competitive area. But while I'm talking about technology, please keep in mind how important to our industry the concept of smart people and smart ideas are. And when we talk about Moore's Law, I think this will become apparent. So let's talk about Gordon for a minute. Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel, 1965, kind of drew that sort of graph on the right-hand side, paper that he wrote. He was really operating off of data collected from 1960 to 1965 when he wrote the paper. 1960 was really the first introduction of an integrated circuit, the sort of thing that Bob Noyce and Jack Kilby co-invented, or had different ideas how to do it, but basically are credited with the co-invention of the integrated circuit. And Gordon said, oh, golly, we seem to get more transistors per chip each year, and seems to follow a logarithmic plot. Isn't that nice? And so maybe it's going to double every 12, 18, 24 months. And you can pick your time frame, but kind of 18 or 24 months is the typical time frame involved. And Gordon was only trying to do one thing when he forecasted that law. He was CEO of a semiconductor company. He was trying to suggest that semiconductors would become more powerful. That is, they would have more electronic functionality going forward because they would have more transistors in them, and that they would become ever cheaper because this law of integration also said it costs about the same every time you double the number of transistors. So this doubling of performance, doubling of capability at an anti-inflationary cost, that is, you always get more for less, was what he was trying to project. And 1965, the projection was made, and then 1975, 1985, 1995, 2005, we're now 2008. So we're 48 years after the first data point on his graph. The law is still kind of obeyed. It's an empirical law. It's not a physical law. It's just an observation. But we use it as the yardstick of our industry to drive forward. We're pretty much on a 2-year cycle today. That is, every 2 years we have a new manufacturing technology. We go from 90 nanometers to 65 nanometers to 45 nanometers, et cetera. We're on our, I think, about the 11th of our 2-year cycles. It used to be a little bit longer than that. We've actually speeded up in the last decade or two. And we can see how this is going to go on for at least another 10 or 15 years. And we'll come into what happens after that in a few moments. But this is kind of interesting stuff to be able to double characteristics, density, performance, every 2 years for nearly 50 years. The history of our innovation, and I'm probably too small for you to see some of the detail up there, and this just shows some of the innovation that's gone forward since 1999 to our current time frame of 2007, 2008. But it shows at the microscopic level, and this is really kind of microscopic engineering, how you can, in fact, put biaxial strain into a silicon gate, and when you do that, the mobility of electrons is faster. So how do you engineer the stuff not to have it stress-free, but to have a biaxial strain present? First developed back in the 2001 time frame. It's been productized for 2 or 3 generations now. High K, or high dielectric constant metal gates. Recognize that our industry, for about the entirety of its history, used silicon dioxide as the dielectric material of choice between the gate and the active silicon. Turns out when that structure gets so thin, because you thin it down with each successive cycle, shrinking the lithography dimensions, when it gets down to only a few molecules thick, the leakage currents start to go up. So one of the ways you cut the leakage currents down, or you get a higher dielectric constant than SiO2 as the gate structure, and then you can make it thicker with the same electrical characteristics. When it gets thicker, the leakage currents go down, and everybody is happy. So we're just making the progression now. Materials were selected for those new gate structures in about 2000, 2007, 2008. The first high K hafnium-based dielectrics come into play. Tri-gate transistor, when you normally think of our industry, you think of planar structures. But at the microscopic level, if in fact you make a 3-dimensional gate, that is side portions as well as the top portion, you can in fact squeeze the channel shut tighter is a simple way to think of this, and cut the leakage currents down. So going to a 3-dimensional gate structure rather than a planar gate structure is also useful. And then you kind of try to combine all these things together and also take advantage of the fact that some of the compound semiconductors have better electrical characteristics in silicon for gate structures. Again, electrons move faster in things like gallium arsenide than they do in pure silicon. You can get higher performance by making heterojunctions or 3-5 compound little layers at various spots in the integrated circuit. So this is the history of innovation of our industry for the last 6 or 7 years. It's more fun kind of if you go back to 1972 when Ted Hoff decided to design the first microprocessor. 1971 time frame when Dov Frohman, studying electron injection into oxides, decided that if you isolated a silicon gate and surrounded by oxide and injected some electrons on it, it would hold a charge for 10 or 20 years, and you could use that charge to permanently program or deprogram a bit of stored information. And then on and on and on, we've had this history go forward. My favorite story, though, is of Bob Noyce at the foundation of Intel. These were back in the days when you could see transistors. You can't even see them with an highest power optical microscope today. You need a scanning electron microscope to see them. But when you could see them with the visible eye, the story is of Bob going to the local photography supply store and getting all of their projection lenses and then going into the back room to try to find the projection lenses with the best optical characteristics so they come back and put those in their production line. I wish they were only that cheap today. But history of innovation, and this is the sort of fundamental research, everything from materials research to basic electron transport characteristics and materials, whether it's strained silicon or 3-5 or heterojunctions and 3-dimensional gate structures. This is the sort of thing we do for a living. Basic research over a period of time gets into applied research, gets into implementation. And so we're perhaps a poster child for how research, basic research, finds its way into the production stream and finds its way into economic wealth creation or value creation downstream. What we do for a living is make transistors. The center circles are actually 6 generations of transistors. To put your mind in the size scale, the one over on the bottom right, the small one, is probably about a 20 nanometer test transistor, and the ones up the top are closer to 60 or 90 nanometers. But these are the sort of generations that we go through. The small images at the lower left happen to be a 65 nanometer regular transistor SiO2 gate, then a 45 nanometer metal gate, hafnium-based insulator under the gate. That's the current advanced generation technology that we have. Those two at the bottom left are magnified at the top right, so you can see the actual gate structure. The gate's on the top, the dielectric or the insulator between the gate and the active silicon is a small region in the center, and then the silicon substrate. And those of you who are electron microscopy freaks will know that we're doing some atom imaging here, and so you're looking at only about 5 molecules of SiO2 and then a little bit more of that of the hafnium-based. But you can clearly image the silicon atoms at the bottom and the silicon atoms in the polysilicon gate at the top on the left. Again, as the comment I made earlier is that gate structure gets to be thinner and thinner, leakage currents go up, so what you want is a higher dielectric insulator such that you can increase the thickness of the insulator, cut down the leakage currents, and get the same electrical characteristics or improved electrical characteristics. That's the rationale going from the left structure to the right structure. Basically, structures were getting so leaky that the power consumption was getting so high they were becoming unmanageable. But we buy ourselves another 4 or 5 generations of transistor structure by just changing the gate material going forward. But this is what we do for a living, and the object is just not to make one of these, but to be able to make 100 million of them hooked up together, or 1 billion or 2 billion of them hooked up together, and have them all work perfectly. So if you're looking at some of the kind of anomalous structures, just recognize that statistically you have to be able to make a couple of billion of these and have them all with the same characteristics wired together to get an active circuit coming out the back end. Our business has been very simple, replacing vacuum tubes with CMOS transistors. And as you can imagine, eventually CMOS transistors are going to be like vacuum tubes. And so the question is, what is the next electronic switch that comes along? We are working on the next electronic switch, and there are lots of options here. I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of things we're working on. This is basically a compound semiconductor stack on silicon, creating a quantum well type structure. And the concept with quantum wells or single electron information storage mechanisms are basically that you can shrink them down much farther than you can shrink a standard CMOS transistor down. And shrinkage or lithography dimensions getting smaller and smaller is what Moore's law is all about. So in this instance, again, on the left you see just a cross-section of a half a micron or so of gallium arsenide and indium aluminum arsenide on top of that. The atomic structure, again, the atoms are just shown as dots on that one. But a quantum well type of structure you can use to replace a CMOS transistor. If you don't like that, you can use something like graphene, which is basically, think of this as a carbon nanotube cut and unfolded as a thin film. And then if you shrink its lateral dimensions down below 10 nanometers or so, it shows the electrical characteristics of a nanotube, and you get the right band gap structure, and you can make essentially a single electron transistor out of this material as well. The nice thing about this is everything we do is planar structures, and so something like graphene or basically this chicken wire layer of graphite atoms is very good for us. So we put that on a substrate and we can make usable circuits out of it. This happens to be some work which we are investing at Georgia Tech. The sort of work that we do in basic research, a lot of it is done with university partners such as this is done. But this is how you anticipate getting well below the 10 nanometer or so dimension where standard CMOS transistors cease to function effectively. I don't want you to run out of the room and think that we're out of gas totally with CMOS transistors. We're just introducing 45 nanometers. We've demonstrated already that the 2009 technology, 32 nanometers, works effectively. We've already shown basically 2 billion transistor static RAM cells that are fully functional, so we're very confident that'll happen. Beyond 32 nanometers, the next couple of generations of CMOS transistors are already underdeveloped. So we have 3 or 4 or 5 generations yet to go before we get into this type of structure. But we are working on these structures as we speak today. There's some other excitement going on in the industry. One is these microprocessors we make crunch more and more data faster and faster. One of the problems is getting data to the microprocessor. You can try to get data to it, bring in electrical signals, electrons in, or you can bring light waves in. And if you want to bring light waves in, you want photonics to be the data transport mechanism, then you need sources, modulators, and detectors that you can integrate into your integrated circuits. A year or so ago, we demonstrated the first continuous wave silicon laser. We've also shown modulators and detectors that work up in the range of 40 gigabits per second. Standard CMOS techniques to manufacture these. The next job is obviously to integrate those light sources, modulators, detectors. You can use silicon as a waveguide material because it's transparent to IR, and you can put the standard waveguide type structures in it. You can use that as the method of moving vast amounts of data at low energy very rapidly from bulk memory into the processing unit and back. So it's exciting to me to look forward to this integration of photonics and electronics, all with the same type of fabrication procedure used. We've already, as I said, demonstrated the light source, the modulators, the detectors. Silicon waveguide stuff is well known. We just need to put all that together on a commercial basis going forward. So lots of excitement there, especially for using or moving and analyzing vast amounts of data, the sort of things that most of the grand challenges, molecular biology, aerodynamic calculations, weather calculations, all of these type of calculations which need vast amounts of data and data crunching. Something like this I think will come forward very quickly. The last example that I wanted to give you of just a technology bit is what's going on in computer architecture. And one of the things that we've done over our history is just made microprocessors faster and faster and faster by running the clock speed up higher and higher and higher and higher. I can remember when we had 25 megahertz 486s, and over my history, every time we've introduced a new product, the first question the press asks you is, why do we need a faster microprocessor? Isn't 25 megahertz fast enough? Well, you know, we're kind of up at 4 gigahertz now, and people still want faster and faster capability. In fact, we just introduced an overclocked 2-chip, 4 cores per chip gaming platform today. I just saw the press announcement a few minutes ago. But the gamers, the people that are interactive gamers and want great video displays, great animation capability, I mean, if they would ever ask or say that we've given them enough processing power, I'd be flabbergasted. In fact, I usually accuse people who ask that question of being kind of middle-aged because it shows what you're interested in. But if you go back to the transistor structure I showed you earlier, and I said leakage current's important, and if you keep clocking transistors at higher speeds, what happens is another form of leakage current comes into play. So you have the choice with these new transistor structures of clocking them at ever higher speeds, leakage currents go up, or backing off how fast you clock them compared to their basic characteristics, clocking them a little slower, and the leakage current goes down by orders of magnitude. So if you do that, you then say, well, why don't I change the architecture to, instead of a single processor core running very fast, I have a number of processor cores running just a little slower. The leakage current goes down dramatically, power consumption goes down dramatically, and as long as I have a programming algorithm which can handle that many core structure, I can do immense amount of calculations. Moore's law continues. It just continues not on a single scalar processor, but on an array of processors. And this is a test chip, which is an 80-core test chip of us. It's not a full functioning Intel architecture microprocessor, but a subset of that. But 80 cores, programmed appropriately, it's a teraflop. Now, I want you to, I can't give a presentation without show and tell. This happens to be the 80-core processor that's shown up on the slide there, and you can see they're little squares, but there's a little bit of memory, but there are 80 small microprocessor cores all working in parallel there. It's a very interesting transition in our industry, going from a simple, faster scalar processors to threaded processors, which is a single core, but 2 virtual cores, now to multi-core, multi-threaded processors, where you have multiple visible cores or separate, distinct cores, each one able to process more than one instruction stream at the same time, so multi-threaded, multi-core capabilities. Not a trivial software programming exercise. Let me put in a plug for the NSF to fund software programming of multi-core processors. We're doing it along with Microsoft. You guys ought to do it as well. This type of computational capability, if you assume that's a teraflop, and we'll say a little bit about perhaps the first teraflop machine, which we helped create at Sandia, I think in 1997, occupied about 2,000 square feet, substantially larger than this room, 500 kilowatts, 10,000 Pentium Pro processors. This one chip has that amount of computational power. And if you go forward, and there's a lot of excitement with NSF, I know, and NSA and others, and Intel and IBM on teraflop computing or petaflop computing or exascale computing, exaflop, I guess, computing. We're getting close to the petaflop category today at 500 teraflops or so. And I suspect within the next decade or 8 years or so, we'll get to basically the million teraflop machine, or the 10 to the 18 flop machine. And it's going to be this type of chip, multiple core characteristics, and it'll be crunched down into 1/10th the size of that original Sandia teraflop machine of many years ago. But very exciting stuff. And part of the excitement probably goes to what you're going to use this for, and what you're going to use this for is obviously the future big engineering problems. The group just came out with the next set of grand challenges. Not that different, I thought, from the grand challenges that we had in the late 80s and early 90s, which were molecular dynamics and aerodynamics and weather forecasting and new drug and new material design, and the new set of grand challenges that just came out, sponsored by the NAE and others, are very similar to that. I mean, there's perhaps a bit of an energy bias in it in terms of fusion, solar, carbon sequestration, other types of grand challenges, but there are also some big physical challenges as well. City infrastructure revitalization, clean water for the world, challenges of that sort. But many of these challenges are computationally intensive, and they're going to require this sort of engineering capability shown in that previous slide, shown by these multi-core machines coming together and giving you petaflop or million teraflop type of computational capability. I want to come back now to the challenges that we face in terms of international competition. And I think basic R&D is one of the three key areas that we face. It creates the ideas for the future. It creates the basis for innovation, the basis for new products, new ideas, new businesses, new services, wealth creation for the economy. And there's no getting around it. You don't do this as just a derivative of today's technology. You have to invest in the fundamental ideas of how to change the technology. This is something that we as business do not do particularly well. The research budget at Intel, the research budget at Microsoft is, I think, equal to or slightly larger than the National Science Foundation's research budget. But most of our research budget is targeted towards products, targeted towards the delivery of products, the applied aspect of R&D. Our investment in basic R&D, that R&D which is 10 years or more out, is a relatively small portion of our overall budget, less than 5%. We're very dependent on what goes on in the basic research laboratory of the US and of most of the world, which happens to be the Tier 1 research universities. That is the research laboratory for the United States going forward. So what happens there we're dependent on. We fund some of it, but the NSF and DOE and other agencies provide the bulk of the funding for that effort. But this is a key driver for innovation. So research is terribly important, and I'll come back, say a bit about what we're doing in that space in a moment. Education is terribly important, and especially education and competency in math, science, engineering. These 3 billion new capitalists who have come in the world, in India, China, Russia, some of the other countries, actually come from countries which have a reasonable, strong educational heritage. They're not slouches in this space. We happen to have research locations in Russia and in China and in India, and I can tell you that the Russians, in terms of software algorithms and libraries, are absolutely the best in the world. They had to be because they didn't have any hardware. And if you think about it for a minute, they competed effectively with the United States without the computational capability of the United States. And how did they do that? They worked 10 times harder on the efficiency of their software solutions and algorithms and libraries to solve the same sort of problems we were throwing hardware at. They're, unrivaled in their capability in that space. Chinese are very good. Chinese obviously have a global plan to, in fact, create 50 Tier 1 research universities equivalent of Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Caltech, you pick one. If you don't think they're doing that, just go and visit China and look at the investment that they're making in that space. If you don't believe that they're doing that at the university level, come back to the K through 12 level. I was telling a few folks earlier, one of the things we sponsor is the International Science and Engineering Fair, which is the international equivalent of the Science Talent Search. We have young kids from 50-plus countries come to the United States each year. PRC sends about 20 kids. I asked the Minister of Education, how many children at the local level participate in local science fairs and provincial science fair to get to the national science fair, to which you pick the top 20 to come to the United States? Only 6 million. If you think there are 6 million kids in the United States doing science fair experiments, think again. So not only at the university level are they beefing up their capability, but at the K through 12 level. And by the way, the other comment I made earlier to some people was, don't think that the research institutions in the United States, still the best university system in the world, are not doing everything they can do to help PRC move forward. You cannot go to a Chinese university that does not have serious relationships with Carnegie Mellon, Michigan, Washington, Cal, Stanford, et cetera, on how to teach electrical engineering, how to teach material science, how to teach medicine, right down the list, business. I just wish there were more law schools involved in this transfer of information. Maybe that'll come in the future. But education leads the way, and unless you have the smart people to go with the smart ideas, you can't continue to demand the standard of living that a leader like the United States has been can command. There's a rule of thumb. The per capita income is going to go directly proportional to the average education and capability of your citizenry to contribute value, and that comes with education. Say a bit about the environment for innovations. I'm near Washington, D.C. Government policy plays a big role. We saw government policy play a role in the last appropriation cycle, where they chose not to fund basic research. They chose not to fund further investments in math and science in the K through 12. They chose not to fund scholarships for students majoring in math and science. That's a bit of government policy. Another bit of government policy is, what is the tax policy? Does the tax policy influence your investments? We build multi-billion-dollar manufacturing plants. The net present value of one of those plants in the United States, compared to a place like China, Malaysia, Singapore, Ireland, Israel, is about $1 billion over a 10-year period. Why is that net present value higher in those other countries? It's because of the tax rate. It's got almost nothing to do with the cost of labor. These are capital-intensive plants. The benefit you get from them is, in fact, the earnings. The earnings are modulated by the tax rate. the U.S. has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It's a disincentive to invest in the United States. I would only ask you to think next time you hear somebody say something about corporate welfare and tax breaks to invest in the United States, ask that person, doesn't that investment create high-value jobs from which you get income tax, and isn't that the real way you fund the government? Not taxing the investment, but taxing the salaries of the people who work in the investment. The U.S. government policy is currently to drive all those investments out of the United States. Not just in my industry, but it's hard for you to find an industry where they're being made in the U.S. going forward. And there are lots of other things the government does to create an environment for investment. Immigration policy is one, and I think you've all been aware of the immigration debate in the United States, the legal immigration debate, which is held hostage by the illegal immigration debate. You want the United States to be the most popular place for the brightest people in the world to come to school and stay and work. And if that were the case, why don't you staple a green card to every advanced degree given to every foreign national in the United States? Something we at Intel started that little statement about 10 years ago, and we're still using it in Congress today. We've gotten halfway there, but not all the rest of the way there. So these are the three things that we have: research and development, education, environment for innovation. You know, how are we doing? USA, compared to a few other countries up here, Sweden, Finland, Japan, Korea, the EU 27, the total OECD average, China, blah, blah, blah. US is magenta colored. The yellow dot was the 1995 investment percent of GDP. Lo and behold, the United States is exactly where it was in 1995 in percent of GDP. Just about every other country other than the EU has gone up. What does that mean? It must mean we're losing ground. And you don't have to look at just this investment. All you have to do is look at the absolute dollar funding for physical sciences. I have to be careful now. For physical sciences, engineering, biology, chemistry, computer science and engineering, material science, you pick your discipline of choice. But it's been kind of flatline funded for 30 years in absolute dollars and down in real dollars. 2.6% or something like that. The EU has a goal to get to 3%. They're not making much progress. Turns out that it's the developed countries of the world which do not shine brightly in all of these trends we're showing, whether they be education trends, investment trends, or environment trends. It's the newly emerging economies or the second-tier economies that are making all the progress because they recognize what's important. But R&D spending is flattish, and it shows up in everything from patents granted to technical papers written. You folks have the statistic on all these, and you know what's happening. We're a decreasing fraction of the world's scientific literature and innovation. And it's hard to be a decreasing fraction of something and be increasing in magnitude or importance going forward. There are challenges in basic education. How many of you routinely look at the NAEP results, the PISA results, or the TIMSS results? You know, who else does? I mean, the last PISA results came out in early December. I happened to be in Brazil at the time talking to the president. He was asking me about subprime mortgages and what impact they were going to have on the Brazilian economy, and I said, sir, you're asking the wrong question. The results just came out. The United States did poorly, but Brazil did a lot worse than the U.S. did on the PISA results. You should have your Minister of Education, who happened to be sitting right there. You and your Minister of Education should have a talk about this. And the Minister of Education was doing figure eights with his toes under the table, trying to hide under the tablecloth. You know, I felt a little bit strange giving the president of another country that advice. So I immediately emailed my friends back in the United States. I said, hey, the PISA results just came out. We were 21st in science and 25th in math or something like that. We were in the bottom half of the top 30 countries. I said, what outrage was there in the U.S. press? And the silence in the room is exactly the answer I got back. There was none. The NAEP results came out. They came out earlier in the year. If you go to the nationsreportcard.com, it's very interesting. You ought to go there sometime and just see how your home state does relative to the national average and relative to the word proficient. NAEP results come out as advanced, proficient, or basic. I have a simplistic definition of those. Basic is a couple of grade levels behind. Proficient is okay. Advanced is pretty good. Proficient, my mind says, you're proficient, you know the subject material. Everybody ought to be proficient. Some people ought to be advanced. On average, less than 30% of our kids are proficient. That means 70% of them are basic. That means 70% of them are a couple grade levels behind. If you don't believe that, look at any exit exam for any state in the United States, with one or two exceptions now that are adopting the NAEP characteristics. Their exit exams are basically at 9th grade level to get out of high school. That means they're willing to accept that kids are 3 grade levels behind to graduate from high school in any subject, most particularly math and science. So we're not doing so great there. Our institutions of higher learning are doing pretty well still. Top 50 rankings of universities in the U.S. In the world are still dominated by the U.S. Top 100 are dominated by the U.S. But as I mentioned earlier, our U.S. institutions are doing the good capitalist thing, and they are trying to sell their capability to every country around the world, which means there's going to be an equilibration of capability around the world. As the Europeans move from their hands-off, ivory tower, don't talk to industry approach to life to be more like the U.S., European institutions will improve. Institutions just starting in Asia, India, China, and those will improve as well. More and more competition coming forward. That's not enough. If those of you who read Georgia Tech does their annual little ranking of countries. I think top 33 countries in the world. And this is, admittedly, if you go get the report, which I did, and you read it, it's a very qualitative assessment of trajectories in terms of educational, national attention to education, national performance of education, high-tech productivity, which is high-tech production capability, and so forth and so on. Look who's number one in their ranking. It doesn't say that China is number one in any of the categories, but it says China's on the trajectory with the momentum to be number one. The USA peaked in its ranking in 1999, 8 years ago, and has been on a downslide with Japan ever since. So, if you look at the national focus, the infrastructure, the productive capacity, the educational focus, one of our own research universities is telling us, hey guys, you're losing it. Now, but you've heard all this in the presidential debates, right? You've heard them talk about our competitiveness. You've heard them talk about what to do with K through 12 education. You've heard them talking about how to invest more in R&D. You've heard them to talk about what to do with the environment and immigration policy and tax policy to make us a greater attractiveness to investment and innovation. You've heard all that. No? I haven't heard it either. This is what I said. The U.S. has to decide that it's going to compete. We are in a current situation of we've been the top dog for a long time. Our economy is still the biggest in the world. And you hear these trite little phrases like, last year our economy grew by almost the size of the Chinese economy, and that's supposed to be good. But every leading indicator says we're going in the other direction. Every leading indicator says the battle's almost lost already. So the question is, how do you get this turned around? Well, my friends at the National Academy, study led by Norm Augustine, published under Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which was really, I think, the seminal study on this topic, came out a couple years ago. We were fortunate enough with a lot of pushing and shoving to get it into President Bush's State of the Union. This is what the Democrats picked up as their competitiveness initiative. That's why the American Competes Act, the legislation, got almost unanimous approval in the House and Senate, but didn't get funded. So we almost decided to compete. Almost. But when it got down to the really hard stuff, appropriating a few $billions, we couldn't do it. And I frankly find this to be extremely interesting when, in the space of a week or two, we could find $150 billion to send to individuals and $500 checks to stimulate the economy. And when you ask anyone in Congress, anyone, do you think that this is really going to help the economy long term? And don't you think that we need some basic stimulus like infrastructure and R&D and ideas? They all say yes. And you ask them, where's the money? And I think what the real problem is that it's difficult for them to think about investing in something that extends beyond an election cycle. And we're currently in an election cycle, and both parties want to try to outdo each other giving money to people because that's what's going to be remembered. And this stuff about parallel programming and multi-core microprocessors, what has that got to do with getting elected? Now, I'm not giving up on this stuff, and I'll make a few comments in my concluding remarks, but the industry is also doing some work in here. The SRC, Semiconductor Research Corporation, which our industry founded about 20 years ago, puts about $100 million a year into basic research, semiconductor-oriented, obviously, both in small grants to principal investigators as well as sort of some mega grants with its focused research program, very much like the NSF Centers of Excellence program. And I think these are good things. But frankly, I see in my own industry an increasing reluctance to continue these investments going forward. As more of the engineering moves out of the U.S., as more of the production moves out of the U.S., what do we need this investment for? These people who have outsourced their manufacturing, for example. Why do we need the next generation of silicon process technology? What difference does it make if the Chinese lead in that space? So industry is not entirely blameless here. But we are funding. We've got some great programs. We impact hundreds and hundreds of faculty members and thousands of students with these programs and do some great research, which helps us go forward. Now, you know, even my own company, we have research relationships with about 150 universities in 34 different countries, so we're not isolated to the U.S. We invest in basic research grants. We have over 250 sponsored projects around the world, and it's small compared to what goes on with the National Science Foundation and other federal agencies, but we're not putting billions of dollars into this. We're talking in the $100 millions range, not billions. But it's our effort to keep the basic research machine flowing. So we're dependent on this, and we're increasingly finding we fund it ourselves. We in Microsoft are just about to formally announce a major parallel programming effort. I don't think it's a secret, but I'm not allowed to tell you where it's going. And most of you already know. We're also big proponents. How do you continue to get the best and brightest in the United States? What do you do with H-1B visas? We have about slightly over 2,000 employees in the U.S. on H-1B visas now. These are the best and brightest students that we have to hire. 50 or 60% of the output of our research universities in the physical sciences are foreign nationals. Guess what? We either hire them here with H-1B visas, or we'll chase them to their home country and hire them there and export the job. To me, it's a no-brainer when I talk to Congress. But will Congress act in this area? Very slow, very painful. I'm not ready to give up on any of these topics. I think the United States has to decide to compete going forward. It has to go back to the rising above the gathering storm with its four fundamental objectives. You know, improve K through 12 education, get more kids through math and science, engineering at the university level, put more basic R&D dollars into the infrastructure, the research infrastructure, and make the U.S. a good place to invest in, either for people to invest their lives or for corporations to invest their dollars. The basis of that report really says technology has changed the world. It's made the world a flat place. But the only way to be successful in this new world is to be able to innovate faster than the competition. And you can't do that without education, R&D, and the right infrastructure. So I hope the U.S. is going to get into that mode soon. I'm a firm believer that nothing beats investing in good people and good ideas. My company, Intel, started off this way in 1968. Arthur Rock, who was the first venture capitalist in the United States, had a philosophy of investing in good people with good ideas. If you dig up the original Intel business plan, it is typewritten, single page, less than 200 words. I think there's one spelling and 3 grammatical errors in it. This was before, word processing, and this is typewritten. It basically says, the transistor is cool. We think there could be a business in integrated circuits. This is going to be the big business of the future. And that's turned into a $300 billion worldwide business today. Arthur Rock said, these are good people. They've got good education, a bunch of PhDs. They've got a good idea, leading edge of technology. He created the venture capital industry to fund Intel. First venture capital funding in the U.S. at that point in time. We continue to have the same philosophy. Our philosophy today is somewhat different. I mean, we're not a startup company, but every time we see an economic slowdown, we have a very simple philosophy which says the only way to overcome an economic slowdown is to invest your way out. Think of that compared to the standard attitude of the press and the financial analyst community of the United States. Invest your way out of a recession compared to save your way out of a recession. And every time we say, you guys don't understand our business, Moore's Law, we're going to invest our way out, they say, you guys are crazy, until actually the economy turns, they find out we're ahead of the competition, they say, oh, you were right. But we get to be right for 1 microsecond before they start criticizing you for spending too much again. But investing for your long-term future has to be the key in any of these high-tech industries. I want to end just by sharing with you the best advice I ever got. There's a Chinese restaurant in Silicon Valley, Chef Chu. I like to go there a lot, and I always wait to get my fortune cookie. But this was one special fortune cookie I got. And this was about 5 years ago, and I was sitting there and opened this up. And it was right about when this competitiveness debate was really getting going, and education debate and R&D investment in the United States. And somehow, whoever stuffed this fortune cookie absolutely had it right, because the fortune cookie says, the world is always ready to receive talent with open arms. And you can't say it any more clearly than that. This is what the world is about today. If you have talent, it doesn't make any difference where you are, what country you're in, what language you speak. If you have talent, the talent speaks for itself, and the world is ready to receive you. This fortune cookie should have come to Washington, D.C. I'm its messenger today, and I'm trying to bring it here. But this is what we need to do as a country, and we collectively need to raise our voices in this arena. Those of you who work in this space, whether you're in academia or National Science Foundation, some other government entity, it's difficult for you to say this sort of stuff that I'm saying now because you work for these people. I don't work for them. And I'm no longer CEO, I'm chairman, so I have enough time to go around and say these things. My work with the National Academy of Engineering, whose job it is to advise the government in a pragmatic fashion on issues of science and engineering technology. But we need to continue to get this message out. We almost got a good start in 2007. just missed the appropriations part of it. We need to come back doubly strong in 2008 and get those monies and those programs put in place. But even more than that, we need to convince our leaders. We do have an election cycle in front of us. We need to get them debating the issue of competitiveness. And we need to have them debate education other than no child left behind is good or bad. We need to have them debate investment in research, not that the U.S. invests more in R&D. Oh, yes, most of it is in weapon systems. We need them to invest R&D across the board in our research laboratory, which is the Tier 1 network of universities that we have in the U.S. And then we need them to focus on creating an environment where we can be the country of choice for investment in innovation, either for people or for dollars. I hope you will continue to join me in this discussion. I hope you'll raise your voices during this election cycle. I think it is key to us. You know, if we don't do something very soon, we will have basically ceded the next generation of engineering to other countries. And all you have to do is just extrapolate every trend we have. K through 12 education, math and science competency. U.S. nationals going on to study engineering, math, science, chemistry, the university level. Graduate degrees granted, patents issued. Just extrapolate every one of those trends, and it means that the engineering profession is going outside of the United States, unless we turn it around. It's possible to turn it around. The semiconductor industry turned itself around in the 1980s, early 1990s. We were losing market share dramatically to Japan, the rest of the world. We turned that around, regained market share from them, and are still the largest semiconductor manufacturing nation in the face of the earth. You can turn these trends around, but it takes a dramatic effort to do it. We need a dramatic effort going forward. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Think Forward. Think Research Channel.